We live under a system that is defined by our Constitution, and our Constitution is completely unique in the history of the world because it's a Constitution that our rights are established not by the king, not by the church. Our rights are established by God Almighty. Simply just because you're alive, I have a right. Remember.
Framingham played a huge part in the Civil War. A fourth of the male population went to the Civil War. They sent a huge contingency. People were very supportive. We had 3 sanitary commissions, which is like a modern-day American Red Cross. And the townspeople were so moved by what the men had done for them that they built a beautiful monument to them in building the Edgell Memorial Library, which was also the first monument to the Civil War. I would have been involved with a sanitary commission, and they got really good at doing what they did. For example, everything was sent in barrels. When they were rolling bandages, they decided that the fibers were too rough and they were going to soften them, and someone said, well, why don't we just boil them and that will soften them? They made them sterile. And that was the beginning of learning about sterile conditions, because a bandage was used, squeezed out, and then used right again on somebody else. And I would have been responsible for putting packages together that would go off to the men. So the men got 2 things. They got a rifle and they got a uniform. If they wanted to have anything else, it had to come from home.
Being underage, you had to be 18 to be a standard infantry, and in the first few months of the war, when everybody was signing up, there was a lot of patriotism. Since the Revolutionary War, there hadn't been a major fight. Everybody was kind of tired of living the old farm life. Like 61 or 62,000 kids had lied. I would lie to be a standard infantry, to do lots of drilling every day. I wouldn't be part of a artillery battery or cavalry. I would just be standard front lines, marching into battle. After 4 years of fighting, almost 800,000 Americans killed. They were running out of young population to keep the fighting force up, and so they started drafting soldiers in, forced draft. The amount of food that they would be given a day would be reduced to 4 ounces of bacon a day and 2 hardtack biscuits, and that's nothing for 1 day.
They're not going because of slavery. They're joining because they don't want to lose their rights. The problem for the Massachusetts soldier would be one, okay, if the country falls apart, does that mean we have no Constitution anymore? And if we have no Constitution anymore, we're losing our rights, and they're willing to die for that.
What I'm wearing now, I'd be considered a wealthy soldier, because a lot of them would be picking up stuff off of the dead Union soldiers. That's why you see a lot of soldiers wearing blue. I'm actually kind of lucky to have a CS buckle. A lot of them would pick up the US ones and turn it around to be SN for Southern Nation. They would leave everything else behind, no tents, nothing. If we were marching, we would stop, eat something out of our haversack, and then just bedroll, put down, and that's it. That was where we slept.
Today I am portraying what my great-great-grandfather wound up being at the end of the Civil War. His name was Almond Scurlock. He was a private with the 27th Ohio Infantry. He began fighting in 1862. In 1863, he got ill, the many various illnesses that were going around during the camps at the time. He was then transferred by request to what was called the Invalid Corps. When you go around, you will notice the uniforms are usually a dark blue jacket and a light blue trouser. That was the standard infantry uniform. The Invalid Corps, which became known as the Veterans Reserve Corps over a period of time, were soldiers who weren't fit for frontline fighting, couldn't go out and march 25 miles a day as required, but certainly could guard railway stations, could guard bridges, could guard supply depots, etc. And they were given a light blue jacket.
The federal government is weak, the state governor is strong, so the governor of Massachusetts would be the one that would approve the regiments. Regiments are theoretically a group of 1,000 men that is commanded by a colonel, and then they break the regiments into wings. One wing is taken by the lieutenant colonel and the other wing is taken by the major. They're forming into lines, which are called the ranks. There's a front rank and a rear rank. The captains are distributed among the companies. There's 10 companies per regiment. Everything moves by the colors, or everything moves by the flag. The flag becomes hugely important in the movement of the force. If the flag hits the ground, the flag goes down on the ground, then the company, the regiment becomes completely disoriented. They have nowhere. That's why the idea of the flag can't hit the ground, and why the flag can't hit the ground, that's to do with a lot to do with that, out of respect.
During the 1850s and 60s, one of the more recreational things that would happen was a very martial time. There wasn't sports, there wasn't anything like we know it today. So instead of things today like a Moose Lodge or an Eagles or even softball teams, what would happen is they would form militia companies, and they would have drill competitions. They were very military in nature. They had their own separate uniforms, just like a modern-day softball team or soccer team. But they would do drill. And here on the common is a lot of times where they would come out and drill and have their competitions. They would do weekend encampments here, much like we're doing today, and sort of like the forerunner of the National Guard, where once a month they would get together, set up their camp, and then they would invite other towns' militia companies to come in and drill with them. There was actually a lot of pre-Civil War drilling, and I do believe the 13th Massachusetts, which was out of Framingham primarily, was, I can't say which companies, but I do know that they were recruited and they did some drilling on this very ground. And you would find one of the 13th Massachusetts national colors inside the Edgell Library.
General Gordon is our local hero. He moved to Framingham when he was 5 years old with his brother and his mother after the death of his father. His mother was the house matron of the boarding house for the Framingham Academy, which is our historical society. He went to the Framingham Academy, then he went off to West Point, and he graduated and eventually ended up in the Civil War. What he did at Antietam, if you don't know, Antietam was the worst one-day battle. There were 23,000 people who were killed that day. What he did at Antietam was monumental, because the Massachusetts 15th Regiment went out onto the field and lost half their men before they were recalled. And it was Gordon who was told to go back out onto the field. And it made a difference in the outcome of that battle. He grew up on the Common, and he had a house over on Central Street, and it still stands today.
77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. For the brave men living and dead who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which those who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.